Donald Trump has been elected the 47th President of the United States of America.
AP making the call this evening, adding 11 electoral votes to the Republican column.
Donald Trump's landslide victory, November 5th. We got our country back. We got our country back.
President-elect Trump has now completed a sweep of these 7 battleground states over VP Kamala Harris.
But I truly believe that this whole election, what led up to it and what will follow, was literally providential.
The win over Democrat Kamala Harris marks Trump's second victory in the state after losing it to Joe Biden back in 2020.
This was God's overlooking us, and I don't want to ever forget that because it seems like it was His will to play this out and give our country back.
Isn't it nice to win? It's nice to win. It's always nice to win.
It's very important to understand why this happened, how it happened, what's going to happen next, and kind of where we go from here. In this video, I'm going to talk about all of that, and I'm going to do it via data and graphs and charts. So why did Donald Trump win? He won because of voter unity, economic dissatisfaction, and a broad desire for change.
Let's take another look at the map and think about a different way of understanding it. It is a stunning election map when you see, especially, you know, those battleground states. It looks like it is on course for a clean sweep.
Symbolic Capital has a great piece walking through why Trump won, specifically focusing on the claims of racism, sexism, elites, weak turnout, etc. Every narrative that people had about the election ended up being wrong. Trump didn't win just because of white voters. He didn't win because all the rich people voted for him. He won because the working class shifted toward him. Trump won because an incredibly diverse electorate voted for him. There's something to be said about the Manosphere as well.
I think what this reveals is the Manosphere is very strong, and it cannot be underestimated. The culture has shifted, particularly among young men, and that is buttressed by so many of these podcasts.
Young men really helped Trump win. Alison Schrager over at Bloomberg Opinion wrote an article talking about Trump's appeal to young men, talking about how they made more money and worked more under him, how they're falling behind in education now, etc. And it's like, yeah, there's the economic part, but there's also like an alienation by society part. I'm going to talk about this more later on in the video.
More than half of the male vote nationwide, 55%, went to Trump, 42% to Harris. Men under 30 saw a dramatic shift from supporting Democrats in 2020 by a 15 percentage point margin to swinging back to the GOP by 13 points. A CNN exit poll also found men under 30 in Pennsylvania favored Trump by 21 points. In 2020, Biden won that same group by 9 points. A part of President-elect Donald Trump's campaign strategy involved using hypermasculine voices like Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock, UFC CEO Dana White. Democrats may have miscalculated the strength and importance in appealing to men. On their party's website, under the headline, "Who We Serve," Democrats showed a diverse list of minority groups, including LGBTQ+, Americans with disabilities, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, women, many other communities. No mention of men.
America is a platform, wonderful rights, wonderful freedoms, directly linked to economics. And I think the Democrats need to re-embrace their strength, which is better markets under Democrats and giving young people more hope. That is what America is about. And Democrats have actually been pretty good at it. They just haven't been able to communicate it.
But society really has alienated a lot of young men. There's a lot of conversations happening around that now. But that's a big part of what we saw in this election. But with that being said, part of his win was that an incumbent, who is Kamala Harris, is always going to be punished for an economy that doesn't feel good. No incumbent won in any country this year because inflation was such a big problem.
This election came down to domestic issues, none more important than cost of living. And that trend is global. Inflation has humbled a number of incumbents this year, whether it's in the Western world or in Africa or in Asia. It's been the ultimate deciding factor.
I heard from many people anecdotally that they didn't want Trump, but they didn't want Harris more. People wanted what they thought they had under Trump back in 2016. So they wanted stability, no pandemic, low inflation, reasonable housing cost. So they vote for that again. And this gets into economic disconnect. Roughly 2/3 of voters rated the economy as not so good/poor per Washington Post exit polls. And of course, this is surprising if you only look at the data. How can people feel bad about the economy while the labor market is strong, the stock market is up, while inflation, not prices, have fallen, and when GDP is booming?
We're getting a look at the issues that voters are really starting to care about when we look at this preliminary exit poll data. When asked what the most important issue was when deciding your vote, 35% say the state of democracy was the most important. The second comes the economy, which is really interesting because when we look at polling across the board throughout much of this campaign cycle, the economy was always the number one issue that folks cared about. Now we're seeing it narrowly edge out the state of democracy.
The economic disconnect is rooted in 3 key issues. Number 1 is inflation, number 2 is deepening inequality, and number 3 is structural affordability that is especially pronounced in blue states, inflation. People told everyone that inflation was the thing that they hated most and that the high cost of living was one of the most important problems to them. When people tell you that, it should be all that you talk about. It should be all that you discuss is inflation is hurting people. And you should come out and say, here's how we're going to fix inflation step by step. And when I first wrote about the Vibe session back in 2022, the economy was completely different. And we were making real progress on inflation, the labor market was strong, and the economy was surprisingly resilient. 2 years later, inflation is near 2%, the unemployment rate is near all-time lows, and GDP is still exceptional. The real pain is that prices are still high. Inflation going down does not mean that prices are going down, that's deflation. This distinction between the rate of inflation and actual price levels has left many feeling poorer despite positive economic data. And there are parts of the inflation narrative that are never going to feel better because it doesn't matter that inflation goes down. It matters that prices go down. But prices going down is an entire complicated mess of deflationary pressures that usually don't bode well for the economy, but it's what people naturally want. Amazing economists like Isabella Weber and the team at Employ America have suggested solutions that can help decrease prices, like increasing spare capacity at ports, utilizing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, building buffers for critical minerals, and implementing policies to curb price gouging and windfall profits. Nobody cares about the flattening of inflation. They only care about the run-up, and we are still high up there. It's important to note that Trump's plans are hugely inflationary, and it could exacerbate the problems that we're facing. And with that being said, rates are sky high because that's what the Federal Reserve does in order to battle inflation. They were raising rates. They did begin cutting recently. Rates zoomed up. Forget financing a house, credit card debt, etc. Compound that with the pain of inflation, and you have a massive problem on your hands where the economy can look great, but people can feel very bad. The second part of this is inequality. Part of it is that there's economic stagnation in a lot of the country because of the fragmentation of industry, because of the slowing down of the labor market, because of the continued growth of AI and what that could do to replace jobs.
There's a familiar story about rising inequality in the United States. The villains are the plutocrats, the fat cats, the tech bros, and the rest of the so-called 1%. The good guys are the 99%, also known as the people. In fact, it's the top 0.1% who have been the big winners in wealth over the past 50 years. Their share of the pie climbed from 10% in 1963 to more than 22% today. But not everybody below them had to give up something. Only the bottom 90% did. In between, there's a third group that has held onto its share of the wealth year after year. Let's call it the 9.9%. We like to pretend that none of this matters because in the land of opportunity, everybody has a chance to make it. But in fact, social mobility is lower here than in many other developed countries, and it's been going down. Aristocrats take wealth out of productive activities and invest it in walls. They lock themselves and their offspring in place at the expense of other people's children. The challenge we face now is to renew the promise of American democracy.
So there's a bifurcated economy, a chasm. The rich are getting richer, etc. Expensive products got 10% more expensive, but cheap products got 20% more expensive. Wealth inequality. This is largely because people buying nice stuff at grocery stores versus buying necessities. The necessities went up a lot in price, and the basket might not reflect that as how we measure inflation. As Annie Lowry wrote in The Atlantic, inequality may be declining, but it still skews GDP and income figures, with most gains going to the few, not the many. The obscene cost of healthcare saps family incomes and government coffers without making anyone feel healthier or wealthier. She continued, real median household income fell relative to its pre-COVID peak. The poverty rate ticked up, as did the jobless rate. The number of Americans spending more than 30% of their income on rent climbed. The delinquency rate on credit cards surged, as did the share of families struggling to afford enough nutritious food, as did the rate of homelessness.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
Just kidding. Sorry, no. We're not all equal. Inequality, in fact, gets a ton of attention these days. President Obama called it, quote, the defining challenge of our time. But income inequality is actually less dangerous than its cousin, wealth inequality. The top 1% hold closer to 40% of the national wealth. So for every dollar in American assets, that's home, stock, savings, all that, 40 cents of it belongs to the top 1%. The top 1% holds more wealth in America than the bottom 90% of the country combined. And a lot of that money gets passed on to their children or their children's children. So no, all men and women aren't born equal. Some are born really, really wealthy.
People felt abandoned. A lot of pandemic-era relief was very important to people, and all of a sudden, a lot of it got pulled. People were not happy about that. Things like the child tax credit, unemployment insurance, Medicaid expansion really helped people. A government exists to help people. And when they pulled that, it made things very difficult. It would have made a lot more sense to keep parts of the American Rescue Plan intact, such as what they did for SNAP. There's a statistic talking about Biden's approval rating after passing the American Rescue Plan. It was 57%. After most of the pandemic aid programs expired, it fell to 43%, and it fell to 37% after all of the programs expired. The third part of this is structural affordability. Housing, elder care, child care, things I've talked a lot about on this channel. People spend about 20% of their incomes on child care. On average, elder care is like $5,000 a month. We don't even need to talk about housing. Housing is enormously expensive, and many have written about how to fix it, including myself. But this is a giant part of the economic frustration that people feel. I was getting a haircut a few days ago to try and fix this bang situation, and my hair lady told me that she felt like all the promises that had been made to her as a kid, she was in her 60s, had been broken, primarily because she can afford a house or afford healthcare. So she's in her 60s, and she feels like all the promises have been broken. Of course, people are going to be mad even if GDP is up or their wages are higher. They don't feel prosperous in one of the wealthiest nations in the world. It's even worse in blue states, as Nolan Gray highlights. Red states like Austin, Texas have built housing, and blue states like California simply haven't. The disconnect between data and sentiment isn't just about the numbers, it's also a symptom of fragmented media that shapes public perception. In an era where people get their news from radically different sources, the story of the economy looks entirely different depending on who you ask. This gap between data and lived experience isn't just about economics, it's fundamentally about how information flows and trust operates in our current media landscape, the information problem. One part of this that's very confusing is people feel okay about their personal financial situation. It's just confusing. It's like, well, what do we do about this? 70% of people are like, I feel totally okay about my finances, but only 18% feel good about the national economy at large. And that's a tough circle to draw square around, you know? And there was also immediate partisan sentiment flip that makes the situation tough to analyze. There was real economic pain, but also people are like, my guy's in office again, I love it. Views on the economy are very polarized depending on who is in office. Everybody does like to be on the winning team, so maybe a bad economy will be good under someone else. And that disconnect does get into terminology. There's a lot of general not understanding of what policy is, and that's not the voters' fault. There's also this WWE SmackDown type politics that everyone's screaming at each other, and it's like, hey, my healthcare, or hey, I can't afford rent, where it's all sensationalized versus actually action. It's something that Stephanie Stancheva has written about, which is another disconnect that people don't see the trade-offs that have to happen with economic policy. They're like, inflation should just be able to go down and prices should just be able to go down. But there's trade-offs to that, right? If prices go down, companies are going to have to lower their prices. They make less money. They're going to fire people. Fired people are going to be sad. Fired people don't spend as much money. Then we have a recession. The disconnect also gets into information sources in media. Alternative media like podcasts were a huge part of this election process. Barron Trump has been rumored to advise his dad, Donald Trump, to go on Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan and go where the people are. Kamala Harris should have done this. She didn't, but she should have because it worked, right? That's what people watch. More people watch Joe Rogan than they do the news. If you want to talk to people, you have to go where they are. In a time of rapid information, going on broadcast television does not work. It's much more interesting, too, to go and chat and be a personality talking anecdote than it is to be a president talking reality. People had misinformed views on immigration, crime, the economy. People think that violent crime rates are at all-time highs, that inflation has still skyrocketed, that the market is at all-time lows, and that unauthorized border crossings are at all-time highs. None of that is true. It's actually quite the opposite. Violent crime rates, all-time lows, inflation is low, market high, unauthorized border crossings low. But those misinformed views are how people voted. So it's a totally different reality than what actually exists. And Trump supporters are much more likely to get their news from social media. They're heavily influenced by the collapse in local news and the news sources that came to fill the vacuum, and how inflammatory everything has to become to capture just one iota of attention. I talked about that in my Mr. Beast video. These economic and information disconnects raise an important question about institutional trust. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Federal Reserve's current position. Institutional credibility. The Fed decreased rates by 25 basis points as expected at their recent meeting, and Jerome Powell highlighted continued improvements in inflation, a solid labor market, and strong economic growth. They will remain data dependent, and he didn't comment too much on Trump's proposed fiscal plans, except for reiterating that the fiscal deficit is on an unsustainable path. But something very important happened. Jerome Powell said no. Here's the whole clip.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. Some of the president-elect's advisors have suggested that you should resign. If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
Can you follow up on, do you think that legally you're not required to leave?
No.
I guess the other question is, to follow up on Victoria's question, do you believe the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
Thank you.
Jerome Powell said that Trump cannot legally fire him. It was his clean, concise no when asked if he would leave if Trump told him to. It was honestly like super cool. I was like, yeah, buddy, that's right. Here's why it matters. Powell's term ends in 2026, and Powell made it very clear that he plans to stay on for that long. It matters for the integrity of institutions and for holding power to account. There's nothing in the Constitution or in the vesting clause or whatever that is like, give that president all the power in the world, let him run free, let him do whatever. Congress has delegated monetary authority to the Federal Reserve through the Federal Reserve Act. Congress is in charge of that. Federal Reserve is associated with government. They are not a government entity. They report to Congress, but they are meant to be independent because imagine this. Imagine we have mega inflation and you have a president that is in charge of monetary policy. They're going to do everything they can to make their 4-year term look excellent. And so we could have extremely volatile monetary policy. Look at what happened before we had a Federal Reserve. We had bank runs. We had JP Morgan having to step in and bail everybody out. He was the guy who was like, enough of this. Like, oh my God, fix it. And so they did through an institution. And so the president does not have the full power to be like, hey, Fed, get out of here. In fact, I believe the founding fathers would be a bit aghast at the state of things. Washington didn't even want a two-party system. Look at what he said at his farewell address. However, political parties may now and then answer popular ends. They're likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. The people that were escaping a king would never want things to be implied that one guy should be large and in charge despite the direction that we seem to be headed. Powell's firm no underscores a critical message. The independence of the Federal Reserve is vital to maintaining economic stability and institutional trust. In an era where trust is eroding, this stance is a necessary assertion of integrity. But Trump is going to make their jobs hard regardless. We need to be able to trust in our institutions in order for them to work. The disconnect. Overall, the economic metrics that we use clearly didn't convey underlying sentiment. There is a gap between numbers and lived experience that needs to be addressed. Inflation is a huge cost. That's why Volcker hiked rates to 20% when he was chair of the Federal Reserve to preserve central bank credibility. Unemployment weakens governments, inflation kills. Some say unemployment only impacts some people, but inflation impacts everybody. Also, with inflation, it feels like you're losing money. It's a loss aversion bias. Like, even if wages go up, it just doesn't feel like enough. And it's also the asset economy versus the wage economy. Like, if you have assets in the stock market or if you have a house, it's not so painful. But if you're just having wages, if you're just having income, it sucks. And that's all compounded by institutional credibility crises and the appeal of alternative narratives via inflammatory media with some lost educational opportunities. I also think there's a lot of validity to the failure of institutions to provide certain things in some blue states like housing, despite things being really expensive, taxes being really high. It's all talk and zero action, and like too much talk that just doesn't resonate with the average person. So that's the problem. The media environment and lack of economic education, not the voters' fault, plus real economic pain in the form of structural affordability and wealth inequality. That, it seems, is a big part of how Trump won. People are tired and scared and they feel left behind. And there's a policy and person disconnect too. People wanted Kamala. 80% of Republicans favored Kamala Harris policies over Trump's in a blind polling. Paid sick leave just passed with 74% of the vote in the GOP stronghold of Nebraska.
I think the paid family and medical leave, we're the last nation on earth basically to not do this. It is so foundational to just basic decency and financial well-being. I think we should do paid family medical leave across the country. And I think that would start to change both finances, attitude, strengthen the family.
Which was a giant part of the Harris campaign, as Walls highlighted. Also, as Amanda Marcotte wrote of Salon, the problem wasn't Democratic policy or messaging, it's ignorance. People backed Trump's aesthetics and attitudes, but knew nothing about his policies. Before the election, some reporters at the Washington Post polled voters about policies without revealing which candidate proposed them. Harris's were far more popular, even Trump voters generally liked her ideas more, as long as they knew they weren't hers. The whole Salon article is interesting, but it gets into bias and lies in the media ecosystem and just how loud everything is. This election underscores another fundamental disconnect. Voters support progressive economic policies when unaware of their source, but vote against the candidate endorsing them due to a gap in information and partisan framing. This is a very short retrospective on the Biden administration. I think objectively, the Biden administration accomplished some phenomenal things. They were heavily focused on manufacturing with the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the IIJA.
President Biden signed the CHIPS Act into law today. The $280 billion plan includes $52 billion in subsidies for U.S. computer chip companies, $24 billion in tax credits for new manufacturing facilities, and tens of billions of dollars for research and development. Chips are needed for just about everything these days, from cars and consumer electronics to medical equipment and military weapons, even kitchen appliances. And modern living is putting increased pressure on those tiny chips. A recent Commerce Department report found demand for chips was as much as 17% higher last year than it was in 2020.
And that doesn't really impact the average person who's struggling with inflation and housing costs. It's an important policy, but it missed out on what people needed, which was support in the face of higher costs and what feels like falling living standards. People also didn't feel listened to. The US has a paradox of prosperity. It is a very rich country, but as discussed earlier on, many of its citizens struggle with rent and food and elder care and childcare, and there were policies around all of that, but they just didn't resonate because people didn't hear about them. People want immediate answers for their pain. GDP growth and high stock prices don't matter to a lot of people. And blue cities are sort of horrible in some places. We saw a lot of blue states go purple where they went more Republican. Anecdotally, I spend a lot of time in New York City and Los Angeles. And in LA, number one, I'm biased because I don't like cars. But I also think there's, number two, this big sense of disorganization and poor government performance. Because you look at it and you're like, this is a city that you pay an immense amount of housing costs and you pay a tremendous amount in taxes. It's exceptionally beautiful, but it's also exceptionally expensive. And it feels very dirty and feels very unsafe, despite this very high cost of living. Those things can only exist in juxtaposition for so long.
And here's a look now at how California voted this year compared to the last presidential election. 2020 is on the left and 2024 on the right side of your screen. California used to be a solid blue state when it comes to national politics, but as you can see this year, data shows the Republicans are gaining ground.
We are already seeing a move from California to states like Texas and Florida because people are searching for a solution. Counties with the highest cost of living shifted toward Trump because if it feels like you're paying for not much, you're gonna move. And red states can build better. People have been leaving California in droves, as I said. Texas is very good at building clean energy because they have streamlined permitting processes, as Alex Stapp pointed out, and they expect to build another 35 gigawatts over the next 18 months, more than 3 times that of California. California should be able to do this. They don't. And these things take forever. Like, when stuff gets passed, it's like, what have you been spending all this time on? The CHIPS Act and the IRA are massively impressive, but the headaches are things like Biden's $7.5 billion investment in EV charging station, which only produced 7 stations in 2 years. Red tape is strangling the party. Things can be very expensive or feel slightly dumb. Zuckerberg had to cancel plans for a nuclear plant because of concerns about rare bees. We need to save the bees. I love bees. I think they're amazing. But we also desperately need alternative energy sources so the bees can also stay here on Earth. There has to be some sort of balance. La Sombrita, a sunshade that costs millions of dollars and provides an inch of relief, it's ridiculous. It took years to develop. Los Angeles has spent 3 years and $7 million on free carts for food vendors, and no cart has been distributed yet. When you see all that as a taxpayer, as a voter, you're like, what are you doing with the money? Where's it going? Josh Barro wrote an excellent piece on this. But mostly I think Americans look around at how it goes when the government actually tries to help, and they have a healthy skepticism about how helpful the government is really going to be, and about whether the benefits are really going to flow to them. Democrats are making too many promises. They instead need to pick a few things for the government to do really well, with a focus on benefits to the broad public rather than to the people being paid to provide the services, instead of trying to do a zillion different things and doing them badly at great expense, as was the approach with the moribund Build Back Better Act. Blue states need to change. Seattle is now doing some design review changes to expedite processes. Thomas Hochman wrote an incredible guidebook that provides a comprehensive understanding of the key environmental permitting issues affecting economic development and to highlight potential areas for reform. We need more of that. Trump seemed like an answer. He was simple and he was straightforward. And he was a bulldozer in a world where people kind of tiptoe, and he was like, hey, this sucks. The policies are questionable, and we'll talk about that later. But people even said that the top reason that they didn't vote for Harris was because they felt like she was more focused on cultural issues rather than helping the middle class, which is not true. Most of her campaigning was about the middle class and addressing some of these problems with the social safety net. She didn't really talk about cultural issues, but where people get their news matters, and if they didn't hear it, it didn't happen. Jonah Furman summarized it well. One thing I think people miss about the fact that many deep red states approved economically progressive ballot measures is that a core difference between a ballot measure and a candidate is that the ballot measure is going to do what it says. Also, people are kind of sick of politicians acting like they have no power. There's a lot of, we better stop this guy, everybody, happening, which is yeah, there's clear issues at hand, and that is entirely your job to handle as somebody who has been given the power to handle this. Stop. So how do we fix all this? The vibe session triangle. It reveals 3 important disconnects that policy must address. Number 1, the measurement gap. Traditional metrics like GDP, inflation rates, unemployment don't capture lived experience. We need new economic indicators that measure housing affordability relative to local wages, total cost of care, childcare, and elder care as a percentage of income, real purchasing power at different income levels, and quality of life metrics. The trust gap. People don't believe economic data even when it's positive. We need visible, tangible improvements. Focus on price levels, not just inflation rates. Prioritize fast, visible wins. Do local implementation over national promises and a clear connection between policy and daily life. There's also an implementation gap. Good policies fail due to poor execution. We need streamlined delivery via Texas-style permitting reform, fewer, better executed programs, clear metrics for success, and visible progress markers. Stop making carts that don't get distributed. Stop it. Stop. You're wasting money. You're wasting time. Stop. The vibe session isn't just about feeling bad when the data looks good. It's about the gap between policy promises and daily reality. When California spends years and millions of dollars on La Sabrita, while Texas rapidly builds clean energy infrastructure, that's the vibe session in action. When the Biden administration celebrates GDP growth while people struggle with housing costs, that's the vibe session materialized. When Harris's policies poll well but people vote against her, that's the vibe session in political form. The vibe session tells us something important about policy. It's not enough for things to get better on paper. People need to see and feel the improvement in their daily lives. Until we close these gaps, we will continue to see this disconnect between data and democracy, between policy and politics, between what we measure and what matters. Sorry for yelling. Okay, Trump's agenda. So understanding these three gaps, measurement, trust, and implementation, helps explain why Trump's proposed policies might resonate despite their potential to worsen the very problems that voters wanted solved. We also have a Republican trifecta on our hands, with Republicans winning the Senate and winning the House. So immigration, Trump has said that he would launch the largest deportation effort in American history on his first day in office. As Bloomberg highlights, this would hit economic sectors such as construction, hospitality, and retail. Prison stocks were very happy about that, but the cost of deportation would be about $300 billion, potentially reducing the U.S. population and labor force by about 9 million people. People do not believe that he will do this for some reason. One voter believes Trump will not deport family-oriented Latinos, since that would be unfair.
If they let in hundreds or thousands of people who already have criminal records, if deporting them creates a mass deportation, I'm all for it.
But what if rounded up in all of that are people who work on a farm? They're doing the jobs that Americans don't want to do. Does that worry you?
That wouldn't be fair. Of course, they need to make sure that they don't throw away, they don't kick out, they don't deport people that are family-oriented.
Housing. He does not have a clear plan on housing yet, except for promoting home ownership through tax incentives and support for first-time buyers, both of which could exacerbate the demand issue that we have in housing. He has also discussed immigration policy as a tool to curb housing demand, kicking people out of the country to free up homes. In terms of education, he plans to end student debt relief as well as shut down the Department of Education. If he achieves this, it would impact all the special education and special needs programs in public schools and public colleges in all 50 states. Tariffs. Of all of Trump's policy proposals, this one drives me nuts because his tariff plan best exemplifies how policy decisions could widen the gap between economic data and lived experience. So a lot of people are searching for information on tariffs, and Trump has asked the protectionist Lighthizer to be the U.S. trade chief. Lighthizer loves tariffs, meaning that we could see this 10 to 20% blanket tariff and a 60% tariff on China get passed. Of course, it still could be a negotiation strategy. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but let's talk about what tariffs are and the impact that they could have on your life. So tariffs are ultimately a tax on imports. So if you're bringing something into the United States of America, somebody could say, hey, you have to pay a 10 to 20% tax on whatever this is. And if you're China, you're gonna have to pay a 60% tax on it. And so of course, those companies are gonna be like, well, how do we make money? We're a company, that's our job. And they're going to pass that cost off to you. They've already said that they're going to do this. So when you go and buy that thing, the thing is going to be a lot more expensive. Tariffs are ultimately a tax on consumers. There's a 100% pass-through rate. And so it could make all sorts of things very expensive. It could increase the price of laptops by 50%, the cost of video game consoles by 40%. Anything that comes in from outside of the United States will become more expensive. And all estimates point to these blanket tariffs as lowering the standards of living. And they could be used just as a negotiation tool. Targeted tariffs are not a bad thing, but blanket tariffs will make everything more expensive. They are a tax on you, the consumer. So this person says a lot of wrong things.
It's incredible to me how many butthurt liberals are coming on here now and acting like they're economists. I'm sorry that you lost, truly, but here's the facts. During Joe Biden's presidency, inflation reached 40-year highs. They're trying to spin it and say, oh, Trump's tariffs are only going to make things worse.
So inflation was high under Biden, absolutely. But a lot of that was a mix of factors like COVID-19, war, supply chain breakdown, tight labor markets, slow Federal Reserve. It was also a global issue. Inflation is not a good thing, but to blame it on one person, one president, is reductive.
Just because something is made in China in your kitchen does not mean it's going to cost 20 to 60% more. That's not how tariffs work.
Tariffs will objectively make things worse. They will cost you an extra $4,000 a year.
Force companies to play ball. They want to be competitive in the U.S. market, so their prices will come down.
The 100% pass-through rate on tariffs.
Are they a fix-all? No. But the same people on here screaming about the tariffs are the same people that support the CHIPS Act, which had tariffs.
The CHIPS Act did not have tariffs. It was a $53 billion investment that had subsidies, tax credits, and R&D funding. There were tariffs on China that were a complement to the CHIPS Act, but again, support for domestic manufacturing, not just penalizing imports.
They're also the same people who support letting the 2017 tax cuts just totally expire and have no means to pay for it.
It would help reduce the deficit if we did let the tax cuts expire, because they will cost about $4 trillion to extend.
Young people came out and voted for Trump because they want the American dream back.
The American dream will not come back underneath one president. The American dream will come back when there's a government that can be responsive to the needs of the people. That includes not making their existence extraordinarily expensive. Trump has said that he would enact 10 to 20% tariffs on all goods that are imported into the country and 60% tariffs on goods that are coming in from China.
So companies are expecting these tariffs to hit just about as soon as Trump takes office next year. And to try to gauge how they're thinking about the impact, we took a look at their earnings calls. So with the help of our data team, take a look here. Transcripts from AlphaSense show that the number of S&P 500 companies mentioning tariffs on their calls more than doubled between the second and third quarters this year. More mentions last quarter than all of last year combined. And one pattern we found here is that when executives are asked how they plan to handle the tariffs, there is no shortage of companies saying very clearly that they plan to pass the higher costs directly on to their consumers.
He does not need congressional approval to do this. Some say that he's trying to negotiate with other countries and show them who the big dog is. That's probably true in a sense, but it's also probably true that he sees sweeping tariffs as a way to pay for tax cuts. Trump plans to extend the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which reduced federal income tax rates, increased the standard deduction, increased the child tax credit. It will cost about $4 trillion to extend, plus the cost of additional proposed end to taxes on tips and end taxes on overtime pay and end taxes on Social Security, and the presumably very expensive end income taxes entirely. This would explode debt to about 150% of GDP. So going back to tariffs, tariffs are taxes on consumers. The way that Trump wants to pay for the tax cut is to tax the consumers via imports. Tariffs are charged to importers, so people that bring products into the US, but the importer's like, that I'm not paying this, and it goes straight into markup. And then you and I, the consumer, ends up paying the price.
For example, if the U.S. put a 15% tariff on a $100 chair from China, the cost of that chair would then be $115 to the American customer.
Let's talk about who pays. Who pays?
Paid for mostly by China, by the way, not by us.
Is it true?
No.
Who actually pays that tax?
The importer pays it, but then passes it along.
They will likely pass a lot of that on to consumers.
Companies have already said they're going to do this, as CBS reported. U.S. retailers that depend on foreign suppliers are prepared to pass along the cost of his proposed import tariffs to consumers, potentially leading to higher prices for a range of products. So depending on what happens with tariffs, things could get pretty expensive. Brendan Duke has estimated that tariffs will cost Americans about $4,000 a year. Erica York of the Tax Foundation.
We've estimated a 10% universal baseline tariff, so applied across the board to all imports, would raise about $2 trillion in tax revenue for the U.S. government over the 10-year budget window. For the average household, that would be an annual tax increase of more than $1,200. If the universal tariffs were 20%, the revenue wouldn't quite double because imports would drop by more. But we've estimated that would bring in about $3.3 trillion for the government and increase taxes by more than $2,000 for average household.
Also, if it's meant to expand domestic production, that's great. There's comparative advantages and competencies, and if we all of a sudden want to start building a bunch of steel here in the United States, resources are going to have to be diverted away from lasers and microchips, right? So it's not like we have all of a sudden it's like everybody's freed up to make a bunch of stuff. It's quite complicated, and other countries will likely get very mad at us. It's kind of a mess. There are already stories rolling in from companies that are preparing for the economic impact of tariffs by cutting off Christmas bonuses. Most economists agree that tariffs and import quotas will reduce general economic welfare. Literally nobody likes broad tariffs, and they've literally never worked. If you want to read more, Cato has a great list of papers. And to just like anchor this argument, the video game consoles could go up by about 40%. Laptops could go up by about 50%. That's going to make the Fed's job very hard. So what are markets saying? So first off, this election was predicted by prediction markets. There's a French polymarket guy that bet $30 million on the election under the presumption of a silent Trump voter. He woke up like $80 million richer the day of the election by betting that the polls were wrong yet again, just like they were in 2016 and 2020.
What is polymarket? It is a predictions market that you can bet on with crypto. It's not available theoretically to U.S. investors. Now, there's a lot of people think there are people finding workarounds in the U.S. to get some bets on there, but we'll leave that aside. But so what happened is, as those Trump probabilities started getting higher and higher, some of those real crypto heads on Twitter started examining trade by trade, and they realized, and this is what the Journal wrote about today, wait a minute, there's some big whales in this market. There's something like 4 accounts that have bets in recent weeks, something like 35 million as of today on Trump.
But from a traditional market perspective, this is where things get tougher. First, Wall Street analysts are forecasting higher inflation and higher interest rates as a result of Trump's win. Some sectors are very happy, like crypto and banks, but some are not, like real estate because of higher rates potentially, and clean energy. The stock market is happy because it's responding to narrative versus data. There's also probably some happiness that the outcome was quick. Joe Weisenthal has called it Rumspringa. All the rules will go away, along with taxes and maybe some stimulus to spice it all up. The market is trying to figure out what will actually happen. Bond yields are one example, especially considering the potential inflationary pressure of Trump and the current stickiness of present-day inflation. And the reason that this matters is because the markets are boss, especially to a president like Trump. He has made the stock market an important barometer to his success. He will listen if the market goes down and respond accordingly. The stock market vigilantes, as Joe Weisenthal discussed, could be the arbiters of what gets done and what doesn't get done. But if they think that he is going to fan inflation too hard via tariffs or tax cuts, a sell-off would inform him. Basically, there's a fourth branch of the US government, and it's the stock market. The paradoxes of a Trump presidency. Guys, the market's reaction reveals a deeper paradox at the heart of Trump's appeal. Even though he campaigns against elites, his victory and proposed policies have already enriched them.
Congratulations again for being on the billionaires list.
Oh, good.
We always underestimate you, but...
we do, but that's okay. That's all right.
Those who deal with you underestimate you and live to regret it.
It's always good to be underestimated.
Again, reporting the facts. People think Trump is just smashing the elite, but his victory did add about $64 billion to the wealth of the richest 10 people in the world due to an already surging stock market.
Elon Musk, the Tesla chief who was one of Trump's biggest financial backers in the lead-up to the election, experienced a nearly $21 billion jolt to his net worth Wednesday, bringing it to $285.6 billion as Tesla's stock closed up nearly 15% on Wednesday at $288.53. Jeff Bezos' net worth is up $7 billion to $223.5 billion after a strong day of trading for Amazon shares, up 3.8%, maintaining his position as the world's second wealthiest person behind Musk.
But these people are also jockeying to get a position in office. So Elon and Vivek are now the heads of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which feels very on the nose for this like post-truth kind of world.
It feels amazing. New York, I got one thing to say first. Hopefully that DOGE cleans things up down to state level. I like how you use the post-victory speech for a political rally.
Like we have a cryptocurrency name and a government organization. Okay, great. But they want to cut the deficit by about $2 trillion, which if they can do it, excellent, awesome, amazing. They're looking to raise about $50 million to do so. Very much needed. If they want to, have tariffs and tax cuts, you're gonna have to make some cuts somewhere. You're gonna have to. But Social Security and Medicare are more than a third of the budget. So I don't know where you cut. I don't know where you cut.
Donald Trump wants to make the government leaner and more efficient, handing the task to Tesla CEO Elon Musk and former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy.
They're working on efficiency, among other things, and they're going to be saving a lot of money and making our country stronger and better.
They'll co-lead the new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE for short.
I don't know if you've got to know Elon yet, but he doesn't bring a chisel, he brings a chainsaw, and we're going to be taking it to that bureaucracy. It's going to be a lot of fun.
For fiscal year 2024, the federal budget totaled $6.75 trillion. Elon Musk wants to slash that by $2 trillion.
Elon Musk, Elon.
In 2024, the highest spending buckets were Social Security at $1.46 trillion, $912 billion spent on health, and $874 billion on Medicare. Musk hasn't given specific plans, but says everyone would be getting a haircut. Ramaswamy, on the other hand, has called for eliminating 75% of the federal workforce. That amounts to 2.3 million civilian employees. He's also called for getting rid of the Department of Education and the FBI. Musk and Ramaswamy announcing they've begun hiring for DOGE. They're looking for super high IQ revolutionaries willing to work 80+ hours a week. A catch is these positions will reportedly not be paid.
The real challenge will be for Donald Trump to get his people who are running these agencies to actually go in and make the cuts and to get Congress to go along with it as well.
And there's like signs of government inefficiency. Mark Goldman had a great list on what the two men could do to reduce waste and make the government more efficient just in healthcare alone. But it will require trade-offs, which people think don't exist. But I really hope they can achieve this. I think it'd be really helpful. And Trump is also making some appointees and has picked a former Fox News host as the defense secretary. He's also named Matt Gaetz, who is accused of all sorts of crimes as Attorney General. I think it's kind of an interesting test of the thesis of the Trump administration that experience doesn't equate to success. Neil Postman has an idea on the way that it could all go. And in saying that the television news show entertains but does not inform, I am saying something far more serious than that we are being deprived of authentic information. I'm saying we are losing our sense of what it means to be well informed. Ignorance is always correctable, but what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? I don't know. It's definitely a sign of the times. These various disconnects in measurement, trust, and implementation point toward a clear framework for change. There's a lot of good writing about what can be done, but this was an information election. The country will have to exist in this kind of paradoxical state for a little bit. Like, will Trump be able to drill baby drill if the oil producers are like, hey, no, we're already at max capacity. We're not boosting domestic production. We have shareholders. I think there's a lot of confusion about what can happen and what has to happen in order for things to happen. Alternative media has created these sealed ecosystems. You know, Trump supporters are more likely to get their news from social media. The traditional methods of press releases and policy speeches and even local news coverage just like bounce off these bubbles. And it's not just that people don't listen, they can't. Like the attention span, information overload, fracturing, deep distrust, algorithm-driven echo chambers, the very apparent collapse of a shared reality. There's the Joe Rogan effect. The success of long-form podcasts tell us something important, that people will pay attention to lengthy conversations if they feel authentic. They want real conversations, not scripted talking points. People like these discussions that acknowledge complexity, like not being the economy is good because GDP is strong. Like they want nuance, right? I think, and space to process information. There's also the TikTok translation. So TikTok is, for better or worse, the place to be. You need to have these 30-second explainers, the personal stories, and visuals when you talk about policy or talk about politics, because it is all sound bites now. There's also the Bashir blueprint. So Bashir is from my home state, and he penned an excellent op-ed about how he, a Democrat, wins Kentucky, one of the reddest states in the country. And a lot of it is being there in person, staying on message, making that message so incredibly crystal clear that you can see the future in it, right? And relating to people personally. He is a dude being a guy that makes his morals very well known. There's a lot of people that bemoan social media, and I get it. Like, it's not a great tool. I made a whole video about it. But it's a tool. At the end of the day, it's where people are. It's where you have to go if you want to talk to them. You can complain about the state of affairs, or you can engage actively with making the world a little bit of a better place. I think that policymakers could learn a lot from using social media because they're able to connect one-on-one with voters in a more direct fashion. But you need to be in multiple formats, you need to have a consistent core message, and you need to have as much in real life talks as possible and connect with community organizers too, not just influencers. And trust is clearly the most expensive thing in the world right now. It costs a lot of money and people demand a lot in order to exchange trust with you. You have to build trust through action. You have to maintain consistency in messaging, and you have to maintain these networks that go beyond just politicians and pundits. The path forward requires closing 3 gaps: measurement, implementation, and trust. Only when we close those gaps can we bridge the gap between economic data and lived experience. We have fractured realities and we have very low trust. In order to fix that, everything has to be messaged in a way that people no longer thought they had to. You have to be on every platform. You have to be talking all of the time. And I think that that is just something that everybody's going to have to absorb, because this was the media election. It was the economy election, but it was also the media election. The path to rebuilding trust lies in meeting people where they are, both online and offline. That's the path forward. That's how we make change. Let's do it. This is available as a Substack, kyla.substack.com. It's also available as a podcast format, and then I post daily short form videos on TikTok, YouTube, basically anywhere and everywhere you get your short form videos. My book is called In This Economy: How Money and Markets Really Work. You can of course buy that. And I hope that you all are doing okay out there, and I'll talk to you very soon.